So we were talking about the environmental organization that you started in your high school. And one of the things you did that I've never heard of is you've financed a machine that turns plastic to fuel. So how does that work?
We worked alongside one of our the science teachers at our school, Daniel Scholbeck, and we worked together to apply for grants and get money for a machine from this company called Blessed, which turns certain types of plastics, types 2, 5, and 6, I believe, into fuel. No, 2, 4, 5, and sometimes 6 into a kind of fuel that you could use to for like heating stoves and stuff, which is really important like for the school in the winter. And a reason we did this is because a lot of the energy coming on Haida Gwaii that we use does come from diesel, and I think it would be interesting if we could use this tiny desktop model of the machine, which would turn 1 kilogram of fuel with 1 kilowatt hour of electricity into 1 liter of fuel, with only the byproducts are water and the CO2 of 3 people breathing and the methane of 1 person eating, which is really, really small for what we get out of it. And then this plastic is dealt with forever. We would use like the small, like the bottle caps from recycling depots and from the school and things like that. Yeah, what we found is that like this is a really good way to start a conversation of can we get a bigger version of this for waste, for dealing with waste throughout the school, or for dealing with our unrenewable energy as well. Like, and not just for the school, for our entire community. So that was like it's a really good way to learn about some of the sciences of plastics and fuels, and also start a wider conversation within the community.
So does this fuel, is it like propane? Like if someone had a propane powered appliance, could they use the fuel from the plastic in a propane machine?
It's not propane. You can actually use it um, as like with a diesel engine, about like 30% of this, and then 70% diesel.
So like a generator or something that
Yeah.
people have. Okay. What else has your environmental club done? And that was in not in the boarding school, but back home.
Yes. The environmental club is for my school back on Haida Gwaii. Good Night Klotskade, the school is called. We have also worked with um, as an environmental organization. We've worked to ban plastic bags in Haida Gwaii and promote sustainable bag options. And we did organized direct action, like through a school strike, and went to the House of Assembly for the Haida Nation and had a bill passed unanimously to ban plastic bags on the island through the Ban Council. So that was really good news. We've had less success with legislation and within the municipalities on Haida Gwaii, like Mass and Queen Charlotte, but we are confident we'll continue to work on these issues.
When did you start that environmental club? What year?
Um, 2018, I believe. We're not doing so much work on it now because, well, I'm not so much involved in it as I am at my other school, but yeah, they're still existing and working to promote sustainable options on Haida Gwaii.
What percent about of the club members are girls?
I would say all but two, so about 90%.
Why do you think that is? Because that's ubiquitous. It's not unique to you. It's everyone I talk to, it's like 60%, something like that, girls.
Why? I don't know. I think it's such a big percentage of girls because, well, firstly, my school just has less boys in general.
Hmm.
But also, I've always thought maybe it had something to do with the fact that Haida society is very like women led. Um, like in the past, it was very matriarchal and stuff. But besides that, I really couldn't tell you. I'd be really interested in hearing what you think the reason is.
Well, what other people have told me is that it's not cool for boys to be an activist. It's cool to be an athlete, to be a musician, but tree hugging is for girls. So that's the coolness factor enters in.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Does that resonate at all, or does that fit?
I think boys are definitely in general more passionate about sports or music or even art than they would be about activism. But like when it comes to adult activists, it's very like equal, I would say, between men and women, and that doesn't seem to become so much of an issue after high school. So that's why I found it very interesting because my father, my grandfather, my uncles all work very instrumentally within activism. But yeah, within high school, I would say my school would be very an exceptional case. We had a total of 80 students. My class had maybe 12 students. So I think it really wasn't that big of a deal for like our tiny community, but I guess that could be a factor. It definitely was more cool to be doing sports, and it seemed to be something that boys enjoyed more.
You said that Haida people tended to be matriarchal. Does that mean they were clan leaders, or were they matrilineal, that you got your last name from your mother, or what kind of leadership roles are traditional for women?
It's matrilineal in that you would get your clan from your mother, and like clan leaders could be like chiefs of a clan could be a man or a woman, but it's passed down through your mother's side. So a chief's son wouldn't be the next chief. The chief's oldest sister's oldest child would be the next chief. And like matriarchs are very instrumental in kind of leading society and like holding the chiefs accountable and leading a lot of ceremonies and like the main facets of our economy, like potlatches and making decisions. That's very matriarch, I would say.
For people who don't know, potlatch is when you exchange gifts, and the idea is that you don't accumulate surplus. You give, and if everyone gives, then it supports the community. Is that a fair definition?
I would say it's like ceremonies. Like a potlatch is held in support of a certain ceremony, whether it's a memorial or a new chief or something like that. And so then the gifts kind of perpetrate our economy. It is like a giving economy, like you said. And it's not everyone giving. It's like the one clan that's giving. Mainly the chief has a lot of cost to himself, but it's like also a way to like increase social standing and of a chief and stuff like that, and kind of transmit knowledge and ceremonies and also economy and leadership. It's very intersectional.
Fabulous. Around the world, climate activists say that we can't really address the climate crisis in a capitalist system. We have to turn from an extraction economy to a regeneration economy, a circular economy, and it sounds like the Haida people have been doing that for centuries.
Millennia, over 14,000 years, yes. I really don't believe that this system of how much can we take and how can we take it will ever really lead to the outcomes that we need in the world. We need to end the climate crisis. And I think Indigenous societies are really the key to um, regenerative practices and sustaining our environment and kind of revitalizing our environment, making it better than it was before. Because we lived on this land and we cared for it for 15,000 years. And in 500 years, Western society has almost destroyed it completely.
Absolutely. Where I live in California, forest fires are a big issue, and people are starting to get the idea, oh, indigenous people knew how to manage the forest, so they didn't have these devastating, huge fires. They managed it, and they had that knowledge from, as you say, millennia of living on the land and respecting it. I really love the idea of giving an offering. If you take something, you offer tobacco or a prayer or something. I think that spirit of thankfulness and gratitude is wonderful. Whenever I pick a rose or a vegetable from my garden, I thank the plant. And I think that's kind of in the indigenous tradition.
Yeah, you're right. It is very important to thank everything because like we are simply a part of the system just like everything else, and as you observe the system how it works, how the system of our ecology works, like look at, for example, the Three Sisters plants in where like sorry, that's not really my culture, so I don't know if I can share, but like you see how everything kind of benefits each other in a balanced system within my community and my culture. And it's like, how do people fit into that? Like, it seems like we just take. And then the most we could give is not messing things up for gratitude. I'm constantly wondering how I can better serve my community and my people, but also the ocean and the communities that give me so much.
Is it traditional? Let's say you harvest salmon. How do you reciprocate with the spirit of the salmon that you take? Is there some kind of ritual involved in fishing?
I'd say a big part of it is you kind of give back to our ancestors, and that in turn would help give back to the salmon. After processing salmon, you would give the bones and stuff back to the water. I know there's some spirituality involved in that. Um, there's also like a lot of things that we don't necessarily practice anymore that we would do in the past, but due to cultural genocide, we don't have access to those teachings anymore, or we simply don't have the time to regularly practice them. So my memory could be a little bit faulty on the exact kind of protocol for these things.
How far back in your chain of ancestors were they forced to go to boarding school and not speak Haida and just speak English and cut their hair and that kind of abusive stuff?
In general, boarding schools, residential schools in Canada have been around from the late 1800s, mid 1800s, I think, to 1996.
Oh, wow.
Yes, but for the Haida, the boarding schools that we were sent to, it's not something like too talked about within the community because, or within families, because it's a very, very painful subject. But it has been going on for generations. Um, and yeah.
So your grandparents didn't go to them, weren't forced to go to them.
Um, my grandparents were very affected by like the 60s scoop, which is, I don't know if you guys know too much about that over there, but it's kind of the process in which social workers would take young Aboriginal children, Indigenous children, and move them into white families where they wouldn't have any access to their culture. So this like kind of theft of Aboriginal children went on like concurrent with and after residential schools, and isn't some cases still going on within Canada today. You can see it within the numbers of children in foster care. For example, there's Aboriginal people, or Indigenous people, are about 5% of the population of Canadians, but on average, I think we make up about 45% of children in foster care are Indigenous. In some provinces, it's really a lot worse, like 70% of children in foster care are Indigenous, and then there's like these clear biases and institutionalized racism in when they take an Indigenous child and a non-Indigenous child, because there's a lack of understanding of like Indigenous ways of caring for children. I know in the past, like if a grandmother was watching children and like a social worker comes to the grandmother's house, like there'll be so much like scrutiny around it and not understanding of the Indigenous way of raising children. And there's like a lot of like medical racism too. Like if you have a child that needs to go to the doctor and they're visibly Indigenous, like nurses will ask a lot of questions like, "Oh, are you happy in your home?" and things like that you wouldn't necessarily ask a white-looking child.
And that kind of stuff is still going on.
Yes.
A big issue that's been in the news in terms of Indigenous Canadians, First Nation people, is the disappearance of young women. And I read that they're associated with the man camps that are formed to build the oil pipelines. And I think Trudeau said he would address it, but I don't know that it's really has been addressed. What do you hear about that?
There was, through like a lot of lobbying from Indigenous women and Indigenous like women-led organizations, there became a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women that went on about 5 years, I think, and then they recently, in 2019, published a kind of their publications from their findings of the national inquiry, which is over 1,000 pages, and it kind of discusses the like roots behind Indigenous women genocide in Canada and its continuation, and how violence against Indigenous women has been going on since the very beginning of colonization, how it's affecting Indigenous communities today, because police are not doing a lot to find Indigenous women when they go missing. Like Canadian society is very apathetic towards it, and like perpetrators feel like they can continue getting away with this violence. It's also like proves kind of a direct connection between violence against our land and violence against our women, because women are kind of facing all of these issues at a very real and higher level when they are in proximity to man camps, when with logging and with like oil activities around Indigenous communities. Also, women are very, very important for kind of passing on knowledge, and this knowledge does not get as passed along if an Indigenous community is without its women. So they kind of published a report which proves by the UN's like standards of genocide that what is going on in Canada right now is currently a genocide, and that kind of not only the government but Canadian societies, Canadian industry is all very complicit. They published 231, I believe, calls to action or calls to justice, which aren't recommendations. They're like legal imperatives. It's not, this is what you need to do to have a good relationship with Indigenous women. This is what you need to do to stop actively oppressing Indigenous women. But it's been over a year since that was published.
Oh.
Trudeau announced that there was a past genocide when he announced the publishings of the report, but he did not admit to there being a current genocide. And even using the word genocide is supposed to like put in place a lot of like legal processes, but those weren't really followed up on. And even though it's been a year since the report has been published. A lot of the things it talked about haven't been followed up on.
What were you involved with this weekend? You were in a some kind of demonstration that was making a statement about the environment. What was that?
I was at the Fairy Creek blockade. It's called. It's a blockade against logging on the northern end of Vancouver Island, a place called Fairy Creek. It is the last intact watershed, old growth watershed on northern Vancouver Island. There's not that much like wood there because of like the speed of technology. It would only sustain about 12 loggers for 6 months, I heard. But they are trying to log it now. The rights to the land have been sold, and there's a group of community members from nearby places and some Indigenous people and an elder who are out there trying to protect this watershed and kind of its significance as an ecosystem because it's the final one in this area.
So did you have tents and camp out, and or what tactics did you use to protect the old growth forest?
Well, we are not like as a school. It's being kind of isolating. I haven't been super involved in it in the past. This was our first time visiting the existing blockade. We camped out overnight in a clearing of an old cut block, so it was already cut. And then we went and visited the blockade and tried to help clean up their trail a little bit because they made a trail where you could visit some old growth trees and see the creek, which is a very beautiful place, and just went to give gifts to the elder there and kind of see if there's any way our school could support the movement in the future.
Terrific. Who owns that land with the old growth trees?
I'm not entirely sure. It's not Crown land. It's privately owned.
Oh.
It was sold from the Crown.
So the hope is to do the same thing there as you did where you turned the ancient lands into Crown land and Haida land.
No, this isn't Haida Gwaii, so it wouldn't be Haida land by any means, but I am not even entirely sure. We just want to end the logging in the area. I'm not entirely sure what the end goal is, as I'm not like a direct organizer in this. I just wanted to go and show my support over the weekend.
There's also been protests against supertankers. What do they do that's harmful?
It's not even a protest, it's a defense of our land and the exercising of our rights. A protest means you're going against, like, protesting Canadian law. We are simply, like, asserting Indigenous law that Canada does not recognize. Supertankers are, and, like, oil companies in general are coming to areas of Indigenous sovereignty, unceded lands, and kind of getting approval from Canada to do industry in these like important places to Indigenous people without the consent of Indigenous peoples of the area, where it can, if there is an oil spill, it will like destroy our lands for forever, and our voices aren't really considered as much as they should be. We should be given free, prior informed consent on all activities. We should be able to give or withhold this consent without any kind of forced, like, actions, without any coercing. But we're not.
What do the supertankers want? Do they just want to, like, dock and spend the night, or what? Or are they unloading and loading, or what function do the super tankers want on Haida land?
Through Haida Gwaii, they want to pass by Haida waters. So a spill would we have a strait, Hecate Strait, that they want to go through, which would is a dangerous strait, and if a spill were to happen, which seems pretty inevitable, then it would like ruin our food security and our ability to practice culturally on our waters and shores.
And what kind of tactics have you used to make the point? What makes efficacy? What makes something happen?
I believe in direct action and um, legislative action and community organized shows of support. Um, I think it's important to kind of use every method at your disposal simultaneously. It can be overwhelming, but you kind of have to attack these things from every angle.
Another angle that you're using is a lawsuit. So you're part of, I think, 15 young people who are suing the Canadian government for violating your rights with climate disaster. Tell us about that.
I'm one of 15 youth plaintiffs suing the Canadian government for their actions as they are kind of um, actively perpetrating the climate crisis and not doing enough to protect the rights and the future of youth within Canada. And as youth, we have the least say in this. We cannot vote. We cannot have our interests reflected legislatively, and so our interests do not become priorities, whereas we will be most affected in the future by the climate crisis. So our rights to life, liberty, and security of person and to equality are violated by Canada's actions towards the climate crisis. We are asking that if we win this lawsuit, the Canadian government instates and creates a science-based climate action plan.
Seems reasonable. You know, well, it's a crisis. Let's have a plan. Doesn't seem too radical to me. So where is it in the process? I know the same group that's the legal arm of the people who sued in Juliana in the U.S. The same group of lawyers are representing you. Where is it in the slow process of going through the courts?
We recently had a hearing with the federal courts where the Canadian government tried to throw out the lawsuits before taking it to court for not being worthy of having a lawsuit. And they ended up winning that. We had all our claims struck, but we are appealing that decision.
So is there a next step, an appeal?
Yes, we're appealing. We're not going to give up. I'm frankly a little disappointed in the way things are working, but I'm not disappointed in that I kind of expected this, you know? I'm not surprised by the action of Canada's government. It really reflects their current policies where they do not prioritize the rights of youth, the rights of Indigenous people, the rights of women, Indigenous women, and I'm not discouraged though. We're going to keep moving in this case, and I'm very looking forward to our next steps because I know this just kind of motivates me to work harder.
You've spoken to UN groups like an Indigenous group and different ones. For most people, speaking in public is scary. It's one of the most common fears. So I wondered if you've had to deal with that fear of speaking to a big group. If so, how did you deal with it? If not, why not? In other words, what are your tips for being an effective public speaker?
I've always had a lot of fears of public speaking. I've spoken to other people who have this fear, and they said, like, if you stop fearing it, um, like, then you don't care anymore. So, like, the fear is good, and you could use it as you speak, because every single time I know how important my message is, and I'm so sorry, that's a knock on my door. Do you mind if I take that for a second?
No, it's fine.
Sorry, I'm in quarantine right now, so.
Oh dear. Were you exposed to someone, or the whole school's in quarantine?
No, just me. I have a bit of a cold and they're taking precautionary measures.
Oh, great. That means you don't have to go to class?
I have to do online school.
Oh, got it. Well, I hope you're feeling good. Um, so, in
Anyway,
public
well,
speaking,
yes. I like my messages are very close to my heart and emotional things to talk about, and they affect kind of my whole community. So there's a lot of responsibility in it. So whenever I do speak in public, there is a lot of fear, but like I'm doing it for something bigger than me. If I embarrass myself, what I'm that's what I do. But it's so much more important to speak because kind of the lives of future generations depend on it. So I try and not focus on myself as much as I can before speaking, and just like you have to do this kind of thing.
right, it helps if you think about who you're speaking to rather than how you're doing, rather than judging how your performance. So your focus is outside. What other groups do you work with? You mentioned doing school strikes. Do you work with Fridays for Future? I know that you've met Greta.
Yeah, I did actually. She's so sweet. Um, she was so inspiring to me. Anyway, I when I did the monthly game, we did a school strike, and our values were in line with Friday for Futures. But coming to Pearson College, we're kind of working for Indigenous education, working with the student council there, and also recently I won the Brower Youth Award, and we have like a really good like network of winners that we're working with to some degree, which is really nice.
And what are those winners working on? What are your immediate goals?
Well, we are actually still everything's very much in the works, but we are wanting to like meet together, and as winners of this year, we've gotten kind of close as we've gotten really close as we've done activities together, and everyone who won is such an inspiring, amazing person, and we think it would be really amazing if we could work together on some sort of conference or something like that. But it's very much still in just beginning phase of the planning. We're just having fun together.
Of those winners, what percentage are girls?
Um, 4 out of 6.
Okay. um, what what's your next kind of focus? What's really on your radar in terms of your activism in the near future?
I'm really going to continue putting my energy into my lawsuit. I'm working to decolonize my school, so I hope that that energy I'm putting into that works out. And in the future, I want to continue doing activism through like empowering other youth and like working to learn and spread my language, which I feel is something that we really need to do in a very short time frame, as we have so few current speakers. So I think that is kind of going to be my focus alongside climate change as much as possible.
Are there people tape recording elders
Yeah.
speaking Haiti? So there's libraries. In terms of decolonizing your school, what specific steps does that involve?
I want to make it a safe place for Indigenous students and students of color, as we oftentimes face so much tokenism and microaggressions, and there's so few Indigenous students at the school, and I really don't think that's okay, as they reside in stolen land.
Right. What are examples of microaggressions for people who haven't consciously seen them in practice?
Um, A microaggression would be someone like seeing someone where they aren't white and being like, oh, like what country are you from? Or I love your accent when like this is my home, like just assuming, kind of othering someone immediately.
Hmm.
A microaggression could be a teacher, like an example of some that I have had this week would be like I told the nurse my name and how to spell it because we had a new nurse at my school, and she's like, and said my name is Haana. She's like, oh, here in Canada we pronounce that Hannah, that kind of thing.
Oh gosh. Oh my. That's amazing. Um, the, part of indigenous traditions, some of which I'm familiar with, is an acceptance of people who are two-spirit, and it's not considered deviant, it's considered just part of life, and maybe having special kind of talents. And I wondered if that's part of your tradition too, of acknowledging two spirits.
Um, the position of being two spirited isn't, I think, traditionally a part of Haida society. There is stories of um, LGBTQ plus representation where like certain beings shapeshift between genders and things like that, um, which I think could kind of be applied. And there's like certain like men who would do like work with the women and stuff, which you hear about through stories. But yeah, two spirit isn't like kind of applicable across all Indigenous nations, and none in mine. So I feel like it's not really something that's my place to talk about. But I really like admire like learning about the beauty of the culture behind being two spirited. But I'm very disappointed as it seems to be something very prone to appropriation.
Hmm. Why do you think it is that your generation Z is so active, so effective, so young? What's there about your generation Z?
I think a big thing about it comes from the climate crisis, but also comes from the fact that we are shouldered with all of this responsibility that older people are saying, oh, it's power to the youth, kind of passing on the stake for young people to become like the change makers of the future at this young age where we're still figuring things out ourselves. And I found one thing in particular with my activism is not focusing on that, on working as an activist being young is on like learning and relying and growing from talking to older activists within my community and change makers within my community because I feel like too much pressure is put on young people to be these change makers and it's kind of a get out of jail free card for older politicians.
It's like you do it. We couldn't do
Yeah.
it, so you do it. Sure.
Not naming any names, but like the way that Justin Trudeau goes to climate marches and then says, and then buys pipelines.
Oh yeah. Oh right. And he's still in support of the pipeline going across to BC, right?
Yeah.
But I think protests succeeded in halting it. What's the current status of that pipeline headed towards BC?
It is set to continue. The land defenders, um, they like to call the proper vernacular is like land defenders and not protesters because protesters is kind of acknowledging the government's hold over you and kind of indigenous claim to land and their laws are a lot more legitimate even though Canada doesn't see them that way. Um, but yeah, it looks like the pipeline is going to go through. So I'm not entirely sure though about the status of the situation.
What's the legal status if it goes through indigenous land? I know in the U.S. the Army Corps of Engineers claims a lot of reservation land, and they have kind of usurped control through government. If it's indigenous land, how can someone put a pipe through it without permission? But
Well, it's
that's
all
probably
indigenous
naive.
land.
That's true.
But there is like a certain way of getting permission where it is under duress or through bribes, which is really disappointing. But like indigenous governance has been very tampered with by like colonial interests. So kind of Canada instated the system of band offices. It was not like a traditional way of governance, but chiefs would be a traditional way of governance. But when you're getting kind of when you get consent by indigenous nations to put a pipeline through their land, there could be a lot of ways of kind of subverting that consent. So it's not real consent, it's consent under duress, like impact benefit agreements, where kind of these corporations will go into a nation and say, like, this is going to happen anyway, like, there's nothing you could do to stop it. You will either try and stop this and get arrested, or you could let it go through now and get some money out of it, you know? But with the pipeline going through like wetsuits and territory, the band office did not. The band office did give consent for the pipeline, but the hereditary chiefs did not, which is kind of the wetsuits and traditional form of leadership. So there's a lot of kind of contention there about, the Western system of government or the indigenous system of government, which one holds legitimacy over giving consent, that kind of thing, you know?
Tricky. The UN has indigenous groups like the Forum for Indigenous Issues. Is that useful in any way? Does it educate people or, inform people about the abuses that are happening? What kind of role does that UN play?
A really instrumental agreement in the fight for Indigenous rights is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the United Nations Permanent Forum kind of has times when it's kind of under ECOSOC, like the Economic and Social Council of the UN, and special rapporteurs of ECOSOC attend the permanent forum, and people from all kinds of indigenous nations all over the world can go to the permanent forum and make recommendations, and their recommendations are either supported by the special rapporteurs and continue on to the General Assembly, or not.
So they can educate and influence, but it's kind of indirect?
Well, it is kind of direct. They make recommendations directly to ECOSOC, which can then pass through the UN General Assembly. One big issue that they're trying to solve, there's a lot of them, including things like the Agenda for Sustainable Development and how it relates to Indigenous people, but also like augmented participation of Indigenous people, because right now, like, the ways to kind of participate in the UN is through either being like an NGO, coming through an NGO, or coming through a government. But Indigenous peoples are recognized as like a state and as a government, so they need like their own special form of participation, so participation can increase. But I actually had the privilege of voicing a recommendation on behalf of like the Canadian Friends Service Society, Amnesty International, Assembly of First Nations, and a lot of other organizations. It was supported by to the special rapporteurs, and but the thing is, over the 19, I think, years of the permanent forum, I'm pretty sure these numbers might have changed, but when I went to the permanent forum in 2019, over 3,000 recommendations had been made, but only 3 had passed.
Oh, geez. And those were all about Indigenous issues?
Yes, it's the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, so
Right.
all recommendations made relate to Indigenous issues.
What were some of the ones that you think should have had priority, that were the most impactful of those issues?
I really couldn't say. It was a very enriching experience, and I felt so empowered, and I learned so much from talking to an incredible amount of Indigenous activists and leaders. And every single issue was very, very important to address. Um, and none of them had enough time, which was so sad. Like, I went to the UN just early in October via Zoom. It was a call about the Convention of Rights for the Child, and that was another thing we noticed. Every single issue we talked about needed to be talked about more. There's simply not enough time to talk about them all in the depth they deserved.
Oh, so that was a different program that you were involved in, the rights of the child for the
Yeah.
UN. And what kind of issues did you hear most that young people were saying, look, pay attention to this?
There were issues on the way that Canada was violating the Convention on the Rights of the child including um, violating them for education and things that have come up around COVID, like discrimination against children with disabilities, um, and discrimination against immigrant children, and issues like that. And another huge issue, of course, is climate change and how climate change affects girls, affects children, affects um, kind of all children.
I would have, just guessing, I would imagine that children, young people would talk about access to good education. Was that an issue that was prominent?
Yes, particularly due to COVID kind of restrictions and the way that unfairly benefits children with internet connections. There was also like how little support there is now for children with learning disabilities because of access to education, which has changed so drastically during COVID. Discrimination against LGBTQ plus children was another big issue brought up.
Discriminated against in the school system or by their peers, or by whom were the most hurtful?
Well, the session was not recorded or anything to protect children's anonymity. Um, so I don't have notes, and it was a while ago. I was speaking, so I was very nervous the whole time. So I couldn't say exactly, but I do know it's like another big thing affecting children. Sexual assault against children was another big issue, and there are so many ways in which children don't have access to justice through the foster care system or access to learning in another language. It's very difficult.
Jocelyn Charger, who's Sue, co-founded an International Indigenous Youth Council. Have you been involved with that or heard about them at all?
No, I haven't actually.
Okay, when I'm going to interview her, and when I do, I'll hook you two together if that seems useful.
That's
Um,
so cool. I would love that.
um, Activists can sometimes suffer from burnout, and there's so much to do, and it's so overwhelming. Plus there's school and family and all these kind of pressures to succeed so you can go to a good college and whatever. So I wonder how you take care of yourself so that you don't suffer from burnout. How do you renew your batteries, so to speak?
I find one of the best things to do is to get out in nature and fulfill my spiritual needs personally. But I also have such an incredible amount of family support, as my family is both really in favor of my activism, but also has a lot of experience within activism, and they're really powerful. It's really powerful to hear their stories and find it really motivating. Also, my this is kind of an unhealthy pressure, but I have the feeling that I can't afford to burn out. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah, are you writing down those stories of your father and grandfather, your ancestors? Because I think that would be beautiful to have them in writing or record them.
I think that would be beautiful too. I haven't done that, but that sounds beautiful.
Yeah, I would. Um, you made me think when you said that when your grandfather and father were protesting, they were sometimes willing to use nonviolence, and I don't know if I heard that right, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant. So I'm wondering if direct action always is peaceful, or what do you do for the sake of the principle?
Yes, direct action is peaceful, like within the Haida people, and we use nonviolence in that instead of like fighting when encountering police violence, we use other means through just being there and making sure they know that their presence is unwelcome in a very powerful way, but not harmful way.
It seems to me what your culture has to draw on is the connection with generations, like we talked last time about the seventh generations, and being able to call on your ancestors and feel supported by them. That seems to me very empowering.
Yes, that's what I have to draw on, and it's kind of what empowers me and motivates me most in life.
Do you think of, oh, my grandmother, or oh, my great grandfather, specific people, or you just think of this kind of field of support and love that carries you along?
Kind of both, I would say.
Okay. Um, all right. Let's see. When I have done organizing, a lot of times what happens is people divide and split over who's the most pure politically. Like, these people are too conservative, or these people are too radical, or these people are flying airplanes, or whatever it is. I wonder if you see those kind of the interpersonal dramas, who's getting more media attention, that kind of stuff, or you don't see it in your organizing groups.
Um, I find within my organizing groups that's not being such a big issue, at least personally, because I'm just honored to have any amount of voice to speak to my actions, and I feel at different times people are better suited for certain issues, and um, I feel like I haven't faced much of that in the past, but I don't know what the future will bring.
I'm thinking like the Bowker Award and media coverage and speaking to the UN and being one of the 15 that it's probably garnered you a fair amount of attention. And some people may think, oh, how come Hannah gets all that?
Um, Within the monthly or anything like, I think outside of activism, we're friends. I'm friends with the people I do activism with, which I think really helps curb some of that also. But people do kind of make fun of me for that sometimes.
You
They're
mean
like, oh, I have a couple lawyers, and then they're like, Haana, with your lawyers.
um, yeah, a lot of people
It's
that
not
I've
a
talked,
fun way though.
they get labeled as the climate girl or the weird climate girl or something, and who always has to pick up trash and recycle the plastic. So sometimes people get made fun of in high school.
I found instead of that, the main problem is because my climate activism is very motivated by my Indigenous activism. Um, I've found I've become more tokenized as like, oh, the one who talks about Indigenous issues,
Okay.
and it becomes kind of like a very unfair role in that white teachers will come up to me and be like, oh, you can talk about this, right, Hannah? You can organize it. And so it's just a lot more responsibility. But I think in general it is not something like, oh, that's so weird, you know?
Mm, got it. I heard the same thing about tokenism from people in India and Africa. It's like, oh, we've got our Indian, we've got our Ugandan, and then like we've done the job. So tokenism really is a problem.
Yeah, within the climate movement, it still seems to be quite white centered a lot of the time. And I think that's really the wrong approach to take for it. Especially, like, you shouldn't really center the conversation around the whiteness of the issue. And I feel like race always plays such a big role in it, or like the lack of race, when, like, in general, like, all people are affected, but you do have to keep in mind that it is going to be Indigenous communities affected first and hardest, and low income communities, which are in general not overly white communities, especially like within Canada.
Yeah, same here, same in the States. I'm thinking of like the Sunrise Movement and Zero Hour. They they in particular pride themselves on having a lot of people of color and a lot of women and a lot of Two Spirit people. So they are focused on not being a white male organization. They're not. So what are the major youth climate activists environment groups in Canada?
Fridays for Future is a really big one. That's being kind of everywhere, which is really good to see. Um, I know there's a lot of like personal youth working within their communities and environments. Like Autumn Peltier is a powerhouse within Canada, a very inspiring person. And the besides that, for like adult groups, like there's um, Greenpeace, David Suzuki Foundation is a big one, and I find that individual bands and nations really stand in solidarity with each other a lot, and youth are a big part of that, which is really good to see.
Mm-hmm. Um, what what do you think about the U.S. election? I think we're all going to be devastated if Trump gets elected again because it affects the whole world, the U.S. environmental policy. Are you following the election here?
Yes, I'm very worried for tonight's outcome. Applying to colleges in the U.S. is getting a bit dicey. Um, so yeah, worried about that, and I'm wishing you like the best of luck, and my heart goes out to all the citizens of America as they await tonight's verdict. Um, yeah, I know it must be very unsafe, and I'm just really glad that that's not Haida Gwaii right now, which is kind of selfish. But because Trump will kind of affect everywhere. I have so many like family members and friends in the U.S. who are so like genuinely scared for the stability of the country and their safety. And yeah, it's very heartbreaking to consider what Trump will do with 4 more years in office.
Can't have it. The silver lining to me is that he brought out all the bad isms of racism and sexism and supranationalism and hyper masculinity. So many people have made fun of Trump, his hyper toxic masculinity. You know, there's a million TikToks making fun of Trump. And I thought that's so healthy because it makes a joke of that kind of masculinity that's so selfish. So in a way, he's done us a service and he's brought out the youth vote. So many youth don't want to have him, and so many youth groups like the Never Again students from Parkland, Florida, and Sunrise, and are have got the youth vote out. So that's the silver lining.
Yeah. Well,
Is there anything else that you would like people to think about in terms of Gen Z, climate, Indigenous issues? effectively educating people that we haven't talked about?
Um, I just want to encourage everyone. I've heard mixed kind of messages about the extent of Indigenous education within America, but just I think it's very important because so many people still think of it as an issue in the past and that Indigenous people are gone. But whose land are you on right now?
I can tell you that.
And why aren't they there anymore? What happens with them specifically?
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of thing, like, people don't know it enough. And, like, where are the people whose land you are on right now?
Right. I'm on Maidu land. One of the Australian girls that's in the book, she started out saying, I'm on Indigenous land of some Aboriginal people. So she got it, that it's an issue. Um, okay. Oh, I wanted to say that we were talking about tactics and putting women in the forefront, and I think I said Bosnia, but I meant Belarus. The current uprisings now, the women in white are in the forefront. And the Serbian young rebels um, in their revolution did the same thing. It calms things down for police to have women in the forefront. Um,
Mm-hmm.
okay, thank you, thank you, thank you.